Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes, an IRONSCALES podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with security leaders and practitioners and other influential InfoSec stars, so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. CyberSecurity Heroes is brought to you by IRONSCALES, the most powerfully simple email security platform. And I'm your host, Brendan Rudd. And now, let's get into the show. Hey everyone, this is another short episode on the unraveling situation in Russia. Recently, Biden gave a warning about potential cyber attack on critical infrastructure companies in the US. The FBI was updated about networks being scanned. So I just wanted to bring on Christian Scott, the COO and CISO and partner at Vanguard, to give us some of his recommendations on what businesses can potentially do to protect themselves in light of any cyber attack against the US. This is also a prequel to an up-and-coming episode with Christian. I launched this segment of the recording a little bit earlier as it's more of a timely discussion and I wanted to get it live before it becomes old news. So let's listen to what Christian had to say. Hey Christian, while I have you here, I wanted to address the elephant in the room, the Russian invasion, and as it's unfolding, what advice can you give to both consumers and businesses to better protect themselves?
That's a fantastic question. So being that my organization is primarily on the red teaming side and doing a lot of penetration and testing of social engineering, a lot of times people think, well, that means that my organization's not staying on the forefront of the latest developments of what malicious actors are doing and, various advanced persistent threats and the various techniques and tooling and processes that they're utilizing, all that kind of stuff. So that being said, our team, we actually have a lot of great guys who come out of the DoD and who have had the opportunity of working out of Europe. And so there's some insight there, but we've always been on the forefront of doing threat intelligence gathering so that we can most closely emulate malicious actors with the intent of breaking into organizations. So when it comes to this situation that's occurring with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I do think that it's important to kind of reiterate CISA's guidance about people should be aware and they should be prepared, but not to panic, right? That panic isn't going to do anything and it's not productive, right? So thinking about some of the kind of proactive steps that organizations can start to take for themselves, I would say would go back to the foundationals, which is, okay, what is your incident response plan? Is it up to date? The list of contacts and the chain of command and the communications line, is that all up to date? Making sure that that's good helps prep you that when something does come around, that you're able to identify and contain the malicious actor as quickly as possible and keep the appropriate people informed on your side in a timely manner. Another big element to note is that when we talk about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the staging that is occurring, this is not just obviously a grave danger and threat to Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe, but also obviously the Western world. And so when people think about this situation of being like a keystone, it indeed is, but cybersecurity warfare has been around between obviously Russia and the West for quite some time, right? So while there are some elements that are novel here, there's also a lot of this that fits traditional history and what's been occurring and what's been staged for essentially the last decade or so, right? So it's important for people to remember the context that when Russia goes to quote unquote strike the United States, that doing things like blocking Russian IP addresses, that is not going to be the thing that protects you, right? That they are staging botnets, right, that are already in the United States, that are dormant, that are ready to strike at a particular time, right? And what they're going to be focusing on first is going to be industries that are going to hurt the most, not just to the United States government, but to the businesses and to consumers, right? And that's going to start with utility infrastructure. So I would call out to anybody who's obviously in that sector of utilities and energy, that kind of stuff, that they need to be really, really aware of what their attack surface is today, right? And then also doing proactive threat hunting inside the organization, right? So as if the organization's already hacked, looking for various indicators of compromise, like suspicious user behavior, suspicious systems behavior, that kind of stuff, right? Beyond that, once utility infrastructure and energy infrastructure is targeted, right, you're talking about things like education and healthcare infrastructure being targeted, and then probably in tandem with that, public cloud infrastructure in the United States. So I kind of like a general like tip two to businesses that I would recommend is ensure that the business continuity and disaster recovery plan is up to date. Most specifically with considerations in place for public cloud infrastructure that you're utilizing and maybe indirectly using. So a lot of times someone will use a software as a service or platform as a service provider. So for example, oh, we use HubSpot for our website and our content management system. That's great. Obviously, HubSpot's going to be using some public cloud platform like AWS or something like that. If AWS gets targeted and HubSpot goes down, is your business able to operate, right? So just having those considerations in mind, I think, is particularly important for people. And so when they're going through business continuity, disaster recovery, thinking about residual impact that may come from vendors, right? A third general point to organizations is obviously backup infrastructure. Again, if there's a loss of public cloud infrastructure and systems where maybe all your documents and all your important data that is used to operate the business is in OneDrive and OneDrive is down, how long can you tolerate that? If you can tolerate it for a couple of days, okay, great. If you can't, then maybe you want to make sure that you have offline backups and that kind of stuff, right, as a contingency measure to make sure that things can go as smoothly as possible if public cloud infrastructure goes down. Generally speaking, and this is being now talked about more just recently this week because the bans on like Russian oil and all that kind of stuff. But I've been noting this for a couple of weeks now that there's going to be a impact to supply chains even further when it comes to manufacturing materials, IT components, fuel, and that kind of stuff. So it's only going to get worse. And so organizations should generally just perform a high-level business impact analysis of understanding, okay, if the supply chain is not that robust, how does that affect the rest of the organization's risk posture? And tying that back to cybersecurity, a perfect example would be, okay, if you're hiring new staff, right, and it takes you 12 weeks to get a laptop for new staff members, right? Like now that's impacting the business and trying to grow its pool of talent, right? Being able to execute on projects, that kind of stuff. And you can't get a laptop to someone in a timely manner. Are they going to use their personal laptop? Or maybe do you want to pivot and try to deploy like virtual desktops that are in the cloud or something like that, that they could use as an interim solution or something like that. So that's why, understanding how the supply chain impacts the business and the cybersecurity posture of the organization is important. And then I would say, probably another good solid point is organization stakeholders and staff and partners and vendors. While we as cybersecurity professionals know what's going on here, and that's great, and generally a lot of the other folks like stakeholders know what's happening with the Russian-Ukraine conflict, tying it together, right, as the bigger impact to cybersecurity and what does that mean and what things to look out for, I think taking more time to educate, right, stakeholders, staff, partners, and vendors about what's going on and talking about it's really important. For example, like, hey, just so we're all on the same page, there's going to be a noteworthy increase in social engineering attacks over the next coming, weeks and months, right? We should be extra diligent and vigilant about what's going on, right? And if we're uncertain about something, let's say something and let's have, the security team or IT team double check first. It's more important than ever. And then lastly, and I know this is, a lot of these come off obvious, but sometimes the obvious tidbits are the things that people like, they brush by and fly past when they're panicking, right? But again, staying in the realm of pragmatism is staying up to date on the CISA alerts, right? The CISA Shields up report is absolutely fantastic. They have a great alert on understanding and mitigating Russian state-sponsored cybersecurity threats, particularly to United States critical infrastructure. And then they always have a really cool catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. So, when somebody talks about vulnerabilities, there's a lot of, okay, this CVE exists, but is there actually a way to exploit that CVE? Is that being actually exploited by malicious actors in the wild, or is it just a known theoretical risk, or it is a risk, right? But it's again not being leveraged quite yet. So what's really cool about the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog is it very particularly allows you to kind of carve down the vulnerability noise and where to focus. Because if you know a particular vulnerability is being exploited by threat actors, you want to fix those ones first rather than the ones that are a hypothetical, oh, hey, we know that we have this CVE and it's being addressed in this patch here. So I think this is the time for people to prioritize, right, when they're remediating the vulnerabilities and weaknesses within the organization. And I think, again, the CISA Know Vulnerabilities catalog is a good tool for that.
Thank you so much. That was a jam-packed list of tips. Can we pivot for a second
Yeah.
to consumer? What can the consumer do to protect themselves during this time of unrest?
Consumers. So I would say going back to practical and pragmatic recommendations. So there's a lot of great services out there like OneRep that allow people to remove a lot of the public information that's known about them, right? So you have all these people finder sites, right? You got your name and all the addresses you lived at and all the phone numbers and email addresses you've had and all your relatives, right? That's really helpful information for threat actors to leverage, right? When they're trying to commit like identity theft, that kind of stuff, right? And so generally speaking, services like OneRep, and there's a lot of other competitors, I'm not like, they're not sponsoring me or anything like that. That's just one that I've personally used in the past. It's worked out well. People being able to remove their data from people finder sites, including their own family members as well, right? So that's a good mechanism. Obviously, services like LifeLock are always really great for monitoring credit and suspicious events that are associated to somebody's identity and that kind of stuff. This is also the time where like people should go back through and take a look at their accounts for like, your bank account and your utilities and electricity and internet and all those things that you kind of have poor password practices on, right? And we've all done it, including myself in the past, right? This is the time to like get something like LastPass or OnePass, or if you don't already, and get your family members on it. They have family plans, right? So that the family can share that type of stuff around with one another. Those are, I think, very specific cybersecurity things. Generally speaking, I'm also a little bit of a prepper. So if there is an impact to utility infrastructure, what do we do, right? And there's a lot of people who live in like the southern United States. They see hurricanes and tornadoes happen a lot, right? So they know always to have, basically like a 2-week plan, right, of supplies and resources. What do you do if you don't have electricity or you don't have heat, that kind of stuff? And so I think it would be really important for people to not, again, panic buy or anything like that. No, 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 no. But for people to be considerate of, do I have a 2-week supply of the food and resources that I need, right, in case this thing goes down? What's my plan if the electricity goes out? And do I have a generator? Do I have fuel for my generator? That kind of stuff. I don't see any major disruption like occurring for a significant period of time for like weeks and weeks and weeks or anything like that. But certainly, I don't think it would be completely improbable for a couple blips, couple days where a utility company might be, essentially out of commission, or for a couple days. We've already seen stuff like that occur. Right. Previously, I believe it was last year, there was a major pipeline in the United States that was hit. They were out of commission for an entire week, basically, or more. Right. So I don't think electricity companies will take that much more time to get back up to speed, but I think at least having 2 weeks of resources, having a plan, communicating your plan to your family, to your neighbors, that kind of stuff is always important, and relying on the community in that way too.
Thank you for that. What can you share in terms of any intel that you may have, or even if it's your own theories around the high-profile breaches that we saw, such as SolarWinds and Log4j, being used as more of a precursor to a potential doomsday event, such as the one that we're witnessing right now? What are your thoughts on that?
Certainly. So, first and foremost, a lot of this is based on theories and based on just kind of patterns of how malicious actors tend to like act, right? And a lot of human psychology and sociology, that kind of stuff. That being said, um, this is not, again, novel, right? The buildup that has been occurring between Russia and the United States has been something that's been occurring for quite some time now. And particularly from a cybersecurity standpoint, again, it's not new or novel. This has been happening for about a decade. That being said, now that things are starting to come to a peak point, there are some patterns and trends that are really, really interesting, right? So when it comes back to talking about like solar winds, and that being about a year and a half, 2 years ago now at this point, that was obviously state sponsored, right? And there was particular targets for mostly high interest targets of government agencies, any vendors that worked for the government, associated with the government, large enterprises, critical infrastructure, that kind of stuff, right? And so going after SolarWinds Orion was really a key target, and that was a state-sponsored attack. And you saw a lot of elements of underlying backdoors and persistence being put into all these different enterprises and organizations that were affected, and a lot of then subsequent data breaches, right, coming out and into the open, and other organizations being impacted. And so last year there was a lot of big talks about like supply chain risk, right? And like how much do you really trust your technology providers? And that's good that people are thinking more in that direction. And like, okay, if this key element in my technology supply chain is broken, or that information is somehow leaked, right? How does that impact the rest of our organization, its function, is really good to know. But with Log4j, what was really interesting with that one was, so it wasn't discovered by, in my understanding, a state-sponsored actor or anything like that. But I'm sure that state-sponsored actors want to leverage it as much as possible. It's even better than what happened with SolarWinds Orion, or even before that, the big one that took down Equifax, which was Apache Struts years ago, because Apache Struts is something that's fairly like obvious. It's web application facing. It's easy to fingerprint, which means that while it's easy for malicious actors to fingerprint, it's very easy to remediate or detect and remediate, right? And close that up, right? And even as fast as people were to react to it, Equifax still didn't react fast enough. And it was only a couple days in which then they got hit, right? When it comes to Log4j, it's not particularly obvious, right, where Log4j exists, because it's a dependency, right, that's used by so many different applications. So yeah, you may have a particular version of Apache Struts that uses Log4j, but you could have some custom application or some other application that's not well documented, right? God knows CVE details and MITRE does not have information on every single piece of commercially off-the-shelf software out there, right? And God knows it's not all well tracked, right? So you can have one tool that you're using that any input, right, can then lead to a remote code execution attack, right, of Log4j on that particular system. So it's really kind of like not particularly obvious. It could be really pernicious, right? It could be really difficult to kind of scrub out of systems and out of your organization. So likely a lot of malicious actors took the opportunity of inserting a lot of backdoors in a lot of different places. And that being said, I was kind of expecting after like Log4j, which was like mid-December, like all these major breaches, all these major attacks, like right around Christmas and New Year's, because that's when malicious actors tend to strike, right? Is when people are, with their family, they're busy, they're not in the office, they're drinking, that kind of stuff, right? And that really didn't occur as much, right? So what that does kind of tell me in my mind is that was used and probably leveraged as an opportunity of setting up a lot of persistence backdoors, right? Creating underlying command and control infrastructure and botnets and that kind of stuff, where just leave it dormant for a while. There's a greater plan to this, right? If things aren't really being leveraged in the moment of around Christmas and New Year's, which is usually a perfect time to try to commit such an attack, then there has to be a better moment, right? And is that better moment now or in the future, right, to leverage that, right? Because I know I haven't seen a lot of additional outcomes from Log4j and all these, what I like to call cascading compromises, right? One vendor goes down, another vendor that used that vendor goes down, and boom, 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 right? So it does lead me to believe that we have more in store, and that people should be, again, not panicked, but prepared for some level of business disruption in the future to some degree.
Yeah, makes total sense. I know it can sound a bit like conspiracy theory, but it does feel like, to your point, that something is still brewing. We haven't seen the worst of Log4j yet. Someone today on LinkedIn was upset that the news cycles have sort of died down so quickly around Log4j
hmm
because he feels like, this still is a problem and we should be addressing it and keeping it longer in the news, in the media cycles.
I think it's a fantastic thought process. To be perfectly honest, it doesn't get the clicks though. It originally got the clicks, right? But now that it's not leading to something that causes a endorphic response in people, right, or at least in the layperson, it's not something that's monetizable, right? So that being said, there is again at least a little bit of it's a very thin silver lining, but a silver lining nonetheless. Talking about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, of reminding people that our geopolitical climate, right, really does have a strong relationship to the cybersecurity and risk postures for organizations, right? And that we really do need to kind of not just one-off malicious actors and advanced persistent threats, but really be considered a state actor still for all types of organizations, regardless of your vertical or size, right? And be pragmatic with the basics. Again, things like having an incident response plan, right? Even if you're a small business, that could be a one-page document, okay? Knowing who you call, right? And what's the channel of communication, and knowing what processes they would follow from a high-level standpoint, right, is nothing particularly crazy. And, even a small business with an hour or two of time can write a high-level checklist. And if that's what you got, right, that's a great starting point there.
Awesome. This was excellent information. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Not a problem.
Thanks, Christian, and we'll be speaking to you again soon. And to everyone else, thank you for tuning in to Cybersecurity Heroes. That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing or following through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening on Apple Podcast, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.